Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, cool. And we are live. Hi, everyone. Join us, and we will get started in just a minute. What am I looking for? Oh, there we go. Right. Second. Okay, there we go. Here we are. Hi, everyone. Sorry about that. A couple of tech pieces to start, as always. Welcome. As always, please grab yourselves a little drink, settle in, text a friend who you know will be interested in tonight's session, say hello, let us know you're here, and we'll get started.
सुबह जैसे आँख खोली थी आपने सोचा कि चलो चाय वाय का बंदोबस्त करते हैं देखते जैसे आँख खोली इधर भी मुर्दा और मक्खियाँ ऐसी उनके ऊपर कि जैसे कि लेयर ऑफ मक्खियाँ नहीं होती जब तक 80 जिंदा तुसी भी जिंदा हो जब 80 मर गए तो फिर उनकी जिम्मेवारी साड़ी नहीं.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being with us on the last quarter of our 16 days. We start today, the fourth last day, and have only 3 more left to go. It's pretty crazy. On the 1st of August, I felt, oh wow, 16 interviews. This is going to be a long 2 and some weeks, and it has just flown by. And I feel like I've been living in a cloud of partition stories for the last 16 days, and I've had so many moments with my own family, and also with so many of you who have very kindly been sharing moments that you've had with your family as you've heard these stories. And yeah, that's just been really, really nice to hear. So thank you for sharing that. And I actually just wanted to put a call out to everyone or anybody who's watching that if you do have a story that you're interested in sharing, I'm not quite sure what we can do to bring these stories out. You might have seen on my Instagram that every day before the session, I post a dish, Instagram and Facebook, I post a dish that relates to the evening session. And it's either somebody's family recipe, or it's a recipe from their community, or it's a dish that holds some sentimental value to the individuals themselves. So that may be one way to connect it. But if you did want to share a story with me, and you did want to find, this is a very, very small platform, but if you did want to share it on this, then please do write into me at hello@thirdculturecooks.com. I would welcome any. I've received a few, and actually that's what gave me the idea. So thank you for doing that. And yeah, like I was saying, I've been posting these recipes. So, I'm here with you guys for an hour, and in our house, we're basically living and eating and breathing partition all day long, because our diet for the last 16 days has been determined by who's on that evening and where they're from. So we get into the zone pretty early in these parts. Yesterday, we heard from the most fabulous and frank Asma Khan. I mean, her account was something. A family at the political center of partition, in conversation with Jinnah, opposing partition, living under threat, and then finally for the family to be split due to the very event that they were opposing. And then, as she said, to feel today like second-class citizens in the country that they chose to stay in. And I was reflecting on it later on, and I was thinking, Asma's ancestry is Punjabi, Bengali, Hyderabadi, Rajasthani, and from Western UP. So I think I would challenge any of us to find somebody who is more Indian than that. I know I'm very monocultural in comparison to that. So I was thinking about that later, and I just thought, wow, like what must that feel like? And I think we got a sense of that from the honesty with which she spoke. So today we are moving on to looking at another perspective of partition, and one that we don't really talk about as much in the mainstream. Partition is very much framed as a Hindu, Muslim, Sikh divide, and it was largely, but India is, as I said this morning in my post, India is nothing if not her plurality. And it's always been what's made India what it is. It's always been what's made us stronger. And that was very much the same before partition, as we've learned through the many stories and also the ones that we're going to hear today. And the Christian Indian population was very much involved in the process of partition, albeit perhaps, as I said, more quietly. There were members of the Indian National Congress and the Catholic Union of India, I believe, opposed the partition and encouraged the political leaders to fight against partition. So there was a voice, and there were Christians who were working from up in Karachi to Calcutta to obviously the Konkan coast down to Goa, and then in the south in Kerala, and everywhere in between. So they were very much all over undivided India. And therefore, they were very affected both by the departures of partition, but also by the resettlements in cities like Bombay, where there was a large Christian population. And, the city of Bombay changed after partition. And what's interesting is that, no, they weren't immediately affected because it wasn't, quote unquote, a Christian issue. And Jinnah wasn't looking for a religious state. And I think this is one of the biggest things that happened after partition, is what his vision was: a secular state with a Muslim majority. What he got was something that went in a very different direction. And then Zia-ul-Haq came in the 70s and took it somewhere else entirely. So, the communities that were there, and we're going to get to the Christians, but I'll just mention also the Bene Israelis and the Parsis who were in Karachi. Many of them felt the need to leave because of persecution that Jinnah had said they wouldn't face. But communities had been riled up by that point, and it's very difficult to bring people back from the brink once you've pushed them there so dramatically. And, people started to be threatened. But as you have in Bombay, the very people coming to the city for a better life, you had similar things in the other big cities, some of which are in modern day Pakistan. So our guest today is going to give us a further insight to that, and some incredible history to substantiate everything that I have just said. Jane Borges is a chief sub-editor and features writer for the Sunday Midday here in Bombay. And she's the author of the brilliant book Bombay Balchao, which is an ode to Kavel, a Christian community here in Mumbai. And if anybody hasn't read it, I would highly recommend it. The description in that book is just beautiful. I mean, you feel as though you're in the church when the couple is getting married, and you're hearing the bell and you're feeling that emotion. And it's a really, really beautiful book. And my dad grew up in Bombay, and it took me back to the stories he would tell as a child of the city a few decades ago. It's not quite the city that I experience today, but it's wonderful. So Jane, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with me today.
Thank you so much, Ragini. It's a pleasure, and thank you for the kind words about my book.
No, it's brilliant. It's really, really good. And if we have time at the end, we might see if we can squeeze something in.
Sure.
So why don't we jump right into it, Jane? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your family and sort of tell us, where you're from, and situate us in the history of your family around the 1940s.
So Ragini, my family is actually from the Konkan part of India, and my dad's side is from Karwar, which is in the north of Karnataka that borders Goa. And my mom is from Mangalore. But we do have Portuguese ancestry because my great-grandmother is Portuguese. And she was from Goa. And her daughter, my grandma, was raised in Mumbai. So, we have families from Goa, Karwar, and Mangalore. And for the Catholics from this part of India, from the Konkan, they are all three different communities, and though they speak a kind of Konkani. The dialect is slightly different.
Okay.
Their food is different. The way they celebrate their customs are very different. So very often, and most of them are also settled in Mumbai. So very often when they're clubbed together as Catholics, they actually take offense because they're very distinct communities, and they um, live very differently. Their customs, culture, food might have some similarities, but they're very, very distinct. And though my family was not really directly affected by the partition, the 1920s, 30s was the time when my grandparents, both from my father's side and mother's side, decided to move from their hometowns in the Konkan to Mumbai for better job opportunities. So my grandpa, my dad's father, Stephen Borges, he studied in Karwar, and his father was a motorman in the railways. And when his father passed away, he thought it would be better to kind of look for better opportunities here. Before that, he was in the army, and he did fight in the Second World War, but we don't really know where exactly. I was told that he was posted in Assam, but because he passed away when I was really small, I was really young at that point, so I don't really have the details and the facts right. But he left the army and then moved to Bombay, where he he learned tailoring skills. I don't know from whom, but he decided that he would become a tailor.
Okay.
And this is one of the jobs that a lot of people from this part of, from Goa, Karwar, were very good at. So they were very good at tailoring, and especially wedding suits and gowns, and one of the most thriving enterprises in Bombay at that point. So my grandfather started with a boutique, I'm told, at the Taj, and before he started his own tailoring business, and then moved to Muscat. My mother's side, my grandfather, he came here, and in the typical Hindi film industry style, he started working for a very well-known Hindi film director at that point, Moti Lal. And so he worked with him, and so they had, he kind of moved in and out with the top Hindi film guys at that point. But so that was very interesting. And he lived in Malabar Hill, and then eventually they started a bakery there.
Okay.
So yeah, so the whole transition, so 1920s, 30s is where my grandparents from Karwar and Mangalore decided to migrate to Bombay. And that was one of the reasons why, what inspired me to write Bombay Bal Chow at that point, even a few years ago, was this very complex history of the Catholics who moved from down south and settled in Bombay, and what was life like for them at that point. Um, Not known to many, this migration began much earlier, much before my grandparents came here to Bombay. It began in the 18th and 19th century, when the East India Company established base here. And many of them from down south saw this as a springboard for job opportunities for themselves. At this point in Goa and Mangalore, many would know that the Portuguese Inquisition had kind of taken a toll on the locals, and post conversions and tearing down of temples. A lot of locals were feeling disillusioned at that point. Some of them settled from Goa, moved down south, settled in Karwar and Mangalore, and that is how you have your Mangalorean Catholics. But even in Goa, at this point, you had plagues and famines, which kind of had a very, very strong impact on the locals. There was loss of lives, and families vanished overnight because of this. And which is why people were looking at moving from, looking to move from these parts of Goa, and as well as down south. And Bombay at that point was still establishing itself. It was not really a port city. Um, the Portuguese had just handed over Bombay to the British. as dowry. And the British really did not see as something as ideal, because it was very, it was not really habitable at that point.
Right.
And you have separated islands, and it was infested with mosquitoes. During high tide, and all these islands would fill up and get waterlogged, just like present day Bombay. And it was definitely not a place where people would want to come and stay. Even the Portuguese, who when they moved to this part of to Bombay, they actually set up their base in Vasai. And they ruled the entire western belt from Vasai, which is the present day, it was then called Bassein. And I don't know if you've been to Vasai Fort, but it's a brilliant complex of churches, and it's in ruins right now, but it's still something you would marvel at if you go there. And that was their fortress at that point. And they really did not see Bombay as the place to be. But the missionaries did live here in Bombay, and they converted a lot of locals. So locals from all classes, from upper caste to, say, the more vulnerable. And they were known as the Portuguese Christians. So they were the original inhabitants of Bombay, the Portuguese Christians here. But and they established their churches, and it was going very well and smoothly. The moment the Goans and Mangalorians started coming here, and the reason why they came here is also because of the familiarity, right? Because they realized that you do have churches out here. It does feel like a semblance of something that they have left behind, back home. Mm-hmm. And when they come here, they settle down in places near churches, because the church was such an important part of their, way of life. And it was something that they really held on to. That is how settlements like Kavel, came to be, because, you had one church or a chapel, and then you had people living around this chapel. And you have so many of them actually in Bombay. And Kavel at that point, I'm talking about the 18th and 19th century, was one of the most populated Roman Catholic settlements in the islands of Bombay. Unlike today, where it's just, we are what, not even a fraction, where less than 1/3 of what we were at that point. So we are about 100 to 200 people right now. But at that point, it was the most thriving community, Christian settlement. And you had people, you had not only local Christians, but you had Catholics from Bombay who, saw this as the place to live, because it just felt like home. You're not leaving anything behind. Right. And so it was how they really moved here. And very, very interestingly, Ragini, when my grandpa came here, my dad's father, when he left the army and he came to Bombay, he actually settled, he lived in a kud. A kud is a club. So every village back home in Goa, Karwar, they had their own clubs in Bombay, where people, especially bachelors who could not afford the steep rents in the city, could stay there for, for peanuts, like a paise or two. And they could, they just brought their trunk here, and they had a bed for themselves. So it was like a dormitory for them. Oh, wow. And it was, so every village had their own dorm, but it was a club, and it was called Kud. So Sadashivgarh, that is where my grandfather was from in Karwar, their Kud was bang opposite the Kavel settlement here in Bombay. So he actually came and lived in Kavel in a Kud, not knowing that 50 years later, his son would buy a property right there. So it's a very interesting connection. But this is how, people moved from Goa, Mangalore to Bombay. And because the East India Company also had annexed certain provinces, right, in the north, and we're talking about Sindh and Punjab, those who came here for opportunities with the East India Company, they saw this as a potential, they saw Karachi, which was connected by sea from Bombay, as a place where they could move and settle. And that is how you have Goans and Mangaloreans moving up north and starting very similar businesses like they did in Bombay. many wouldn't know, but the Goans were very, very enterprising. So they were bakers. They were and the more educated and more affluent were doctors, architects, and engineers, and they played a very important role in building Bombay. Then you had the bakers, you had the ayahs, the maids, who actually went across the world, really. The Goan maids were not only were very, very common in the Gulf, and even for, I think, right now, they're very, very common. You'd see a lot of Goan maids in the Gulf, but the maids and the cooks, and so they did all kinds of jobs, really.
It was mostly the East India Company that
actually drew them to, yeah. And then obviously, yes, and then obviously jobs and this was just not the Goans. I'm talking about the Bene Israeli Jews, and so even the Parsis from Bombay, even they moved up there for better job opportunities. I mean, it was just growing and flourishing, right? The business. Mm-hmm. So say the restaurant business, if the Parsis started it, they had people who worked for them, and these were the Goans. Most of them were Goans who worked with them, and I think the Parsis and Goans got along really well, which is why they took up. They actually worked together in many places. So this was how the transition happened. I think with the Goans, it was just they really never saw. They just wanted a place where they could grow and expand, their businesses. And Bombay seemed like a good start. And when Karachi opened up, and more Goans started coming into Bombay, it just felt like there was too much.
When Karachi opened,
I'm talking about mid 1800s, really. Okay. So at this point, even in Karachi, and from whatever reading I have done, most of my, I've been doing a lot of reading ever since you told me that I had to come and speak about the partition. But even in Karachi, you have the American missionaries who have come in at this point, and they play a very important role in setting up, networks of hospitals and schools, and even education of women becomes very, very important. You have lots of convents coming up at this point, and conversions start taking place. In all of Pakistan, especially in Punjab, you have villages that are getting converted. You have model Christian villages. So where you would just have a handful of Christians, say in the 1850s, just before the partition, you had about 500,000 Christians in Pakistan, which is a very significant number. Yeah. So within 100 years, they had managed to, and you have entire villages being converted. So you have model Christian villages in Punjab. I'm talking about
completely separate communities from Karachi.
Separate communities. So they have their own churches. Yes, yes. Karachi was very, very vibrant at this point. It had people from all walks of life. Because it was a port city, it was very much like Bombay. But, you're talking about the villages, which were more disconnected from the city. Even there, Christianity was becoming more prominent because of the missionaries who were there and doing their work. And so this is Pakistan, say, before partition. You have all kinds of people. When the partition happens, really, the Christians don't really know what side to take, because this was really a struggle about Hindus and Muslims. And that is what the partition is made out to be. And Sikhs had to really take a side here. Where do we go? Pakistan, India. But for the Christians, especially for the Goan Christians, there was really no side to take, because Goa was still part of, was under the Portuguese rule. So they technically still, they still belong to Portuguese Goa. Yeah. So even if there is a partition that, happens, Jinnah really did not say he was building a Muslim country. He still had a very secularist vision for Pakistan, though he did want a separate country for the Muslims. He did not push at this point, Islamic ideals and values. And the Goan Christians um, were actually, and even the Parsis for that matter, were more privileged because of the businesses that they set up in Pakistan. They played, especially Karachi, they played a very important role. Schools, hospitals. So they did enjoy, and even for that matter, in the civil services, postal services, the Karachi Port Trust. So they were everywhere, and they did play a very significant role. So they did live a very privileged life, and they did not feel different, and they did not feel they belonged to either Pakistan or India. So it was not like they had to take sides. So they decided to, many of them decided to stay back after the partition. There were interesting stories, of course, and I read about the Indian civil services in Punjab for that matter. It was the Indian civil servants from Punjab were considered to be the most elitist because they really rose up the ranks very quickly. And at this point, when the partition happens, there were five Christian Indian civil servants in the Punjab force, and they were asked to take sides. So, do you want to be part of West Punjab or East Punjab? East Punjab is, going to India. West Punjab will be part of Pakistan. So, those who were from, say, I'm talking about the Britishers, they decided it would be better to retire and go home. But the Christian Indian civil servants, they had to take a call. And there was one very important name here, Samuel Martin Burke, who decided that he would retire because he was actually very affected by the idea of partition of India, or the partition and, India, Pakistan. He really did not want to belong. So he decides to retire. And he was he joined the Indian Civil Services in 1931. And by 1947, it must have been 16, 17 years. So that was actually early retirement. But he decided that he would live in Martinpur, which was again a model Christian village, and that you get the name Martin. So Martinpur, and that was in West Punjab. So he says, I'm going back home. I'll stay there, but I don't want to be part of, I'm not taking a call. I don't want to be part of any government or be part of the civil services.
Right.
And he retires. But I think over a period of time, Pakistan felt the crunch. They really did not have officials with experience. And Jinnah personally invited Samuel Burke, asking him if he would join the foreign services because he needed his help at this point. We really don't know if Burke was willing, but he agreed that he would join the foreign services in Pakistan. And one of his initial roles was handling India and Kashmir issue at the UN. And he served in the foreign services for nearly 2 decades, and started with the Pakistan High Commission, and then moved to become the ambassador, the first non-Muslim ambassador from Pakistan, Thailand. And then he eventually retired in the US and joined the faculty at University of Minnesota. But he is the oldest living Indian civil servant because he died in 2010 at the age of 104. And so that is his story. But what is very interesting is Samuel had 11 other siblings, and his youngest sibling, Chand Burke. And by the way, they get the name Burke because his father had a Muslim name, because they were Muslims who were converted, and his grandfather converted to Christianity, but his father still had a Muslim name. His name was, let me get it right for you. I think it is, just a minute. It's Janab Khairuddin Burke. And he was an Urdu poet who wrote under the pen name Burke. And that's how, they got the surname Burke.
Oh, how interesting. And I assumed
yes,
it was the Christian name Bourk.
No. So the pen name was Barq, and Samuel took the surname Burke.
Okay.
But his youngest sister, Chand Burke, was very well known. She moved to Bombay. So because the family was everywhere and most of his family members actually moved abroad, Chand came to Bombay and she joined the film industry. And she was seen in several films, including Boot Polish back then. And not known to many, Chand Burke is actually Ranveer Singh's grandmother. She ended up marrying a Sindhi, and she was Christian, Chand, but she married a Sindhi and settled in Bombay. And she then, so Ranveer Singh's grandmother, paternal grandmother. So that's a very interesting history. And Ranveer Singh has a very interesting family legacy that he doesn't talk too much about, but he should, I think, because I think his family has a very interesting partition story.
Okay.
And so he has Christian Sindhi roots, and his great grandfather was a very well known poet. It appears so, Urdu poet. So that is how I found that history very, very
Hollywood
fascinating.
is never too far away.
Yeah, it wasn't.
It comes
And it comes everywhere. It just connects. But so this is a very, very interesting history for that.
I might just
Yeah.
so the British East India Company, someone's asked the question, did they prefer is the wrong patron, either Protestants, like did they patron Protestants over Catholics more, or did they treat
No, not really, and I don't think that was much of a problem. They did want they were really looking for people who could help put this city together. So they did not differentiate, and not like, we know in Bombay, the Muslims, the Parsis, and the Catholics played a very Christians, not Catholics, but Christians played a very important role in the initial years, building of the city. So even among the Muslims, trading was very, very common. And I think the British opened this for everyone. So they never really um, did distinguish between the Protestants and the Catholics. In Bombay, they did have a very complicated history because they were very instrumental in creating a friction between the East Indians and the Goans, And one of the reasons why the East Indians are, by the way, the local Christians of Bombay, and they took the name East India to affiliate themselves with, the British. They were actually from, because both of them are Portuguese Christians, right? They both were converted by the Portuguese. They had very, very similar cultures except for the language. I think the Christians here spoke, their dialect was more like the Marathi that they spoke here, and the ones down south spoke Konkani. But the British did interfere in church affairs, which created some kind of discord between the East Indians and the Goans. But that is another complicated story.
Yeah, no,
because
absolutely. Pakistan, would it largely, what is now Pakistan at that time, would it largely have been Catholics? You have the Punjabi Christians.
Not Punjabi Catholics, no, they were a mix. And if there were Catholics, they were actually from the ones who traveled from south, so Goa, Mangalore. But the Christians out there were so they were Protestant Christians, because the missionaries came from everywhere, including America. So you have the Presbyterians and all of that. And so I think it was largely Protestant Christians in down south, because the Portuguese never really traveled up north for conversions. They did try, and they were fairly unsuccessful. They've been trying since Akbar's rule. They actually did try and convert Akbar too, but and they were very, very desperate. But they did not really manage to do that. But I think the Catholics who came to Punjab were from this part of town, from Bombay, Goa, and down south. But mostly Christians out there were Protestants.
So we didn't have Christmas at the Mughal courts then. They weren't successful.
Sorry?
Said we didn't have Christmas at the Mughal courts then. They weren't successful with Akbar.
No, they actually, when Akbar did encourage, a lot of Christian art in his court. He loved the paintings of Virgin Mary. He did read the Bible and all of that. So he was a very he was a patron of Christian art,
Yeah.
and a lot of that was found in his court. He did also encourage. He did not stop people from converting,
Right.
but he himself did not get converted, though he did have the missionaries did come there, the priests did come there, and they stayed with him for several years, but they failed to convert him.
Well, that was a little segue, sorry, but
Yes,
so
yes.
let's go back to Karachi in the 1940s. So we have, a community built of the Catholics that have come from the Konkan and other parts of India as well. We have the Bene Israelis, the Parsis, the Hindus, the Muslims, all together in this sort of thriving port city. And then partition happens. So what happens to the Goan Christians in Karachi?
In the beginning, they, like I said, they really did not, they were very happy being where they were, very comfortable. In fact, I think, for the lack of a better word, they were really disconnected from what was happening. I'm talking about, the partition. It did not really affect them directly. I think even for that matter in Bombay, a lot of Goans still consider themselves to be part of the Portuguese, of Portuguese Goa. So that, that feeling of that nationalism and all. I'm specifically talking about Goa and not the other Christians, the rest of India, because they still consider themselves to be part of India. But because Goa still was very much under the Portuguese rule, there was really nothing, they really did not lose, they had nothing to lose here. So many of them did stay back, and they would keep coming back to Goa for Christmas. So and Jinnah never really stopped anything from happening. Your churches continued, celebrations continued. At this time, Karachi is a beautiful place to be in. And they're moving forward. The scars of partition are healing, even if slowly. But there were stories about how the converts in Punjab, I'm talking about those model Christian villages, they were being frowned upon by locals, the Muslims there. And they felt the need to move towards the south. So they come to Karachi, which is more hospitable towards them. So this is where, in the rest of Pakistan, there is still this little, you are feeling the ruffles, and everyone, people are feeling a little uncomfortable. So, there is the movement of Christians from these villages to Karachi, primarily because they did not feel that they belonged. But Karachi was still a very happy place to be in, and very, very culturally thriving for that matter. One of the first girl bands to come from Karachi was a Goan band, and they were called the Xavier Sisters. They were a band of 5 girls, and they played everything from Goan music to Punjabi songs and French, Spanish, pop songs, and they performed everywhere. So they performed at jam sessions. They performed for radio, TV, and they were quite popular. I'm talking about mid 1960s. So by then, you still have this group of people. Jazz was very, very very popular, just like it was in Bombay. It was even in Karachi. And the Xavier Sisters were one of the most popular girl bands there. And you still have photos. If you kind of Google search, you'll find photographs of this band. Very, very, everyone loved their music. But what is happening at this?
Christian had like the Catholics played a similar role in Bombay, when it came
Yes.
to music and the performing arts and the sort of the cultural elements of the city,
Right.
or at least the anglicized cultural elements of the city. It was really
Exactly.
taken forward by these communities, and that's what a lot of people grew up with and grew up listening to. And I know my dad's in here, and I'm sure this will resonate with him because he grew up in that Bombay, going to, around that. And so it sounds like it was
Yeah.
quite similar in Karachi, where it was really this
Exactly.
that took that forward.
Yes, and what happens at this point is, I think for the first 20 years, you do not feel too much. And, Karachi is still this lovely place, very cosmopolitan, and things haven't changed for them. But I think it's in the early 1970s, and, if you talk about the Xavier sisters, two of them, so there were five of them, two of them go abroad to study, and then you have male members joining the band. But by mid 1970s, they disband and they move to Canada. And this is the story for about a lot of Catholics and Goan Catholics who, not only in Karachi for that matter, but even in Bombay, but in Karachi specifically because, Zia-ul Haq comes to power and he is very determined to make this a Muslim nation, and this Islamization of Pakistan is what starts making people feel vulnerable, especially the minorities here. Um, I think the Bene Israelis felt it much earlier in by the 1950s itself, because there's something completely happening that's a very religious, that's another story in itself, the Muslims and the Jews. But with the Muslims and Christians, I think because they were a minority, they started feeling um, uh, they felt that they're going to be affected in this whole process. And it was better to move abroad, and that's why they start moving from Pakistan to Canada, London, Australia. This migration is also happening, by the way, in Bombay, in Goa, and settlements like Kavel they start shrinking by mid 1970s, because people have decided that they'll find a new land that they can call home for themselves. But in Bombay, the reasons were different. I think they were looking for better job opportunities, a better life for themselves. Um, and in Karachi, I guess it was a lot to do with being minority and the whole, Islamization that's happening at this time. And you can feel it, you can sense it with the Xavier's band. They suddenly disband and they leave, and they pack their bags and left. And this happens with a lot of Catholics in that part of Pakistan, in Karachi. They decide to, move lock, stock, and barrel. Um,
So,
very.
sorry, go on.
No, continue. Yeah.
No, go ahead, finish your
Yeah, but yeah, so I was talking, but there was another band that came up at the same time called the Benjamin Sisters, and surprisingly, they they thrived during this time in the 70s and 80s. So they were a Christian band, and they became one of the more popular pop all-female bands of that time. And their music, so they used to sing in the choir, by the way. Their father Victor was a xylophone, he used to play the xylophone, and he kind of encouraged his daughters to sing, and they all sang in different voices. Very interesting. So they started with choral church singing, but when they become popular, their music also changes, so their themes change, and a lot of their themes are about nationalism, love. So all of this, suddenly you can feel the politics of the time also influences the music and culture that is there. And I think bands like them needed to show their uh, you know that they belong to the country, and that they were proud of being Pakistani. So I think that is a very interesting take. So you have, from this, you have the Benjamin Sisters. They continued. They, even today, they're in some way or the other involved in music and culture in Pakistan.
Well, they
But
still
then,
exist as a band.
no, they're not as a band anymore. They disbanded by 1980s because they married and they had other responsibilities.
Okay.
But they're still part. Like, one is a voice artist, one teaches music. So they're still very much in Pakistan and performing. But unlike the Xavier sisters who moved, they never really did. It's just that the nature of their songs changed, and
Right.
but there was really nobody stopping them. They were still very popular, and
Yeah.
very, very popular Pakistani band is what I believe.
Well, we have a little clip of theirs which I can play now
Yes.
to share with everybody. Just give me 1 second. All right.
गाड़ी को चलाना बाबू, गाड़ी को चलाना बाबू, जरा हल्के हल्के हल्के, कहीं दिल का जाम न छलके, दिल का जाम कहीं न छलके, गाड़ी को चलाना बाबू, गाड़ी को चलाना बाबू, जरा हल्के हल्के हल्के, कहीं दिल का जाम न छलके, दिल का जाम कहीं न छलके, गाड़ी को चलाना बाबू. जालिम है ये हिचकोले, जालिम है ये हिचकोले, मेरे दिल की दुनिया डोले, मेरे दिल की दुनिया डोले. है रास्ता ऊंचा नीचा, जरा हौले हौले, है रास्ता ऊंचा नीचा, जरा हौले हौले, मेरी जुल्फ उलझती जाए, मेरा नर कलेजा धड़के, गाड़ी को चलाना बाबू, गाड़ी को चलाना बाबू, जरा हल्के हल्के हल्के, कहीं दिल का जाम न छलके, दिल का जाम कहीं न छलके, गाड़ी को चलाना.
So there we go.
Yes.
Yeah, that's like really
So you get a lot.
sweet.
You can hear a lot of that on YouTube. Fortunately, there is a lot of Benjamin sisters on YouTube. It also shows how popular they were.
On YouTube.
So they performed for radio, television. Yeah. They were everywhere in the 80s.
That's awesome. That's awesome that it's still something we can access to. That's really special. So the community sort of shrunk over the years, and Goa obviously joins India, and so does that. Sort of two questions around that actually that I have for you. One is, does Goa joining India motivate many to return to India at that point? And secondly, what was the change like from going, from saying I'm Portuguese to saying I'm Indian? And maybe you can speak to that personally as well. Like what does that feel like? And was it difficult for people? What happened with that identity?
I would say that Goa, becoming part of India did have play a very important role in how people across the Goans across India who had settled in different parts of India, especially in Mumbai or Karachi, saw themselves, and they realize now, especially the Goans who at this point did not in Karachi didn't they always thought that they were part of Portuguese Goa. Now you are Indian, or if that identity changes, you're an Indian in Pakistan.
Yeah.
I think here is where they have to take that stand for themselves. By then it's already been 12 or 13 years since the partition, and because this takes place in the early 1960s, so you're very much part of Pakistan now. So what is your identity? And that complicates it a little. And obviously, a little less than a decade later, you can see the political environment in Pakistan also starts changing drastically. So many of them are forced to take a stand for themselves. You are either part of this, or you are, you need to go back. And where do I go? And I think because it is true that Christians did participate in India's independence struggle. While we don't talk about them as they're not spoken, when you're talking about say the likes of Lokmanya Tilak, or say your Subhash Chandra Bose. They don't become these standout figures, but they were very much part of the freedom movement. Um, Even Goans for that matter, a lot of Goans wanted to be part of India, and which is why the Portuguese were eventually ousted from Goa, because they did feel that they wanted to be part of this country. And you have freedom fighters from Goa, and most of these freedom fighters call themselves freedom fighters because they struggle to get the Portuguese out of India. So their freedom is of a very different kind, because this was not only about liberation from the British, it was about liberation from the Portuguese. So the Goan freedom fighters actually wanted to be liberated from the Portuguese. So I'm deviating actually, but there were freedom fighters from.
But that is the freedom, though. So please, if there's more to share on that, I think everybody.
Yes. But where was I? I'm sorry, but I was talking about how it's not like they did not concern themselves with the politics in Pakistan,
Right.
or India for that matter. It's just that it was very complicated for them, because there were many layers to this. It was not as simple as being Hindu or Muslim, and that is where you need to start figuring how things would be for you. In Bombay, I can speak for the Bombay Christians, because I know family that from our family, so many decided to leave Mumbai and eventually settle down in Canada. And I think it was they still do they still do very much consider themselves as Indians, but I think that belonging was, it didn't affect them as much at this point to be uprooted, because this is a time where India is changing, and people are looking for a better life. And
let's come to that. So your
Yeah.
family has been in Bombay for generations.
Yeah.
And like we said at the beginning, Bombay was one of the cities that all of a sudden you have all of these Punjabi and Sindhi refugees who have flooded the big cities of India. How did life in Bombay change for those that had been here before that, and especially those that were neither Hindu nor Muslim?
I don't think your Christian families were very large. So every like my mom's family, there were 12 of them at this point. And I think they were more concerned about how do you get how do you feed a family of 12 or 14 people. So I think at this point Bombay has become this hotbed where you have communities from everywhere coming in. Everyone's trying to pick up lost sticks and come together and build this place for make this place their own. So I'm not very I cannot really say. I'll talk about Cavell, for instance. It was a Catholic village, and I think um, in it completely isolated itself from the problems of the world, because they had their own. It was such a large community, and they had their own things happening. Very very culturally thriving. They were not really. How do I put it?
Sort of insulated from
They were insulated from everything else. It's not like they did not see this happening around them. They were different, things happen over a period of time that do affect Cavell. You have the Hindu-Muslim riots, and Cavell is sandwiched between a Hindu pocket and Paidhuni, which is not very very far away. So the riots also affected this little village, but it was very insulated, and there were so many Catholic villages in Bombay at this point that they already felt like they belonged, because they had their people around, and they had their church. It was not, and I don't think they were very very torn or affected by what was happening outside. Is my guess.
Yeah.
Because my grandfather did my mom's dad, he did speak about this to me when I remember I was a teen, and he lived in Malabar Hill, which is the place of the Hindu and the affluent Hindus. So
Right.
again, very, very insulated pocket in South Mumbai. Same with my dad's mom. She came from Masgao. Again, a Catholic settlement, very, very insulated from what is happening,
Side of it.
outside. I don't, they have never spoken about, they do speak about the independence movement, but they didn't really speak about the partition with
Mm.
me. And I used to find that very interesting because uh, I think, in a way, it was not something that affected them directly, and that is why that sense of disconnect.
Hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. Which is, uh, yeah, it's interesting because we don't really separate partition and independence, right? They both happen
Yes,
simultaneously, and
simultaneously.
yet not both of them apply to everybody on the subcontinent.
Exactly.
They mean
Yes.
completely different things. So,
Yes.
no, that is really interesting. Um, and finally, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about, so to my understanding, the Christians from the Punjab in Pakistan who felt a lot of pressure about being Christian, and as you mentioned, they came down to Karachi, and they are now the ones who sort of populate the clergy in Karachi, and or so they sort of keep the faith there, or is there still a
Yes.
Goan Christian population in Karachi that is, alive and well, or have they all sort of moved off to Canada and other places?
Not necessarily, not everyone did move. I'm talking about a small chunk of population, but a significant number, because again, the Christians are a minority in Pakistan. So even if you talk about a small chunk that is moving, you will feel the absence,
Yeah.
right? But I think the ones who really played an influential role were the clergy, who kind of, like you said, kept the faith together. And the Punjabi Christians, as they're known, they do play a very, very significant role in, and it's still a very, very significant community in Pakistan. It's not like it's disappeared and
Right.
has vanished. But I think with partition, many of them, the Punjabi Christians too, they had to make a choice whether you stay in West Punjab or East Punjab, and most of them decided that they'd stay back in their villages. So these villages could have been in West Punjab, they could have been in East Punjab. For them, it was, where is my village? I want to
Right.
be at
Yeah.
home. But
Yeah.
for the Hindus and Muslims, this was not something that they didn't have this choice. They didn't have the
Right.
choice to be part of, to stay back in their villages. It was, they were conflicted, because you have two separate countries now, and one is primarily for the Hindus and the other for the Muslims. So that choice was not something that the Hindus and Muslims had, but the Christians definitely had. They had the luxury of staying back home, and it didn't matter where this home was, India or Pakistan.
No, absolutely, and you're right. You're right. That's a perspective we don't often think of. That actually, in this, there was a community that had choice because
Yes,
we didn't, right? And I think
yes.
that's an important thing to
Uh,
remember.
it would be unfair to say that they were not affected by the partition. They did lose friends. They did lose people who, and because they are also um, um, uh, converted. They were very recent converts, right? So you did have family. You did have Muslim relatives. You did have Hindu relatives, and you do lose family in the process. But I think those struggles are something that I think we have not really captured in our history as much, and someone should have,
Absolutely.
those voices got lost.
Yeah, we were just yesterday we were talking, the theme of divided families, but you're right, they weren't converted to Christianity too far before partition happened.
Exactly,
It was in living memory, perhaps for some,
exactly.
um, when that happened. So yeah, absolutely. If anybody has any tips on how we can better collect that history, please do let us know. If you know someone we can talk to and hear their story, that would be amazing. Someone's asking whether Punjab and Sindh converts to Catholicism, Catholic or Protestant, but I think you mentioned that it was various different groups and missionaries who
Yes,
have come down, so it's
yes,
a bit of a mix. Yeah.
yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. And the last question that I'd seen, which is a little bit unrelated, but can you just maybe talk a little bit about the Christian settlements in Bombay? So Cavell is obviously one, but then around Bandra and Chium village, you have these other ones. Are they
Right.
all from the Konkan and then or East Indian,
No,
or are there
so
other communities?
they are mixed, but they're
within that as well.
they're primarily Goan or East Indian villages.
Okay.
And you don't have a Mangalorean village in Bombay. I find that very interesting. But I think the Goans, they were all East Indian villages at some point, and the Goans really overrun and come in large numbers, and that's what happens in Cavell, because Cavell is one of the oldest East Indian villages in Bombay, in the islands of Bombay, and suddenly it you have this large. And when I'm talking about this migration, it is huge. It's a wave, and you have chunks of villagers from one village moving into Cavell. So even today, I know there are the residents of Cavell. Most of them belong to, say, Para in Goa, and you then realize that there is this they all decided at some point in time that they would come to Bombay, and because you have people here, it becomes convenient to come and settle down in Cavell. So your neighbors are here. They tell you that this is a good place to be in, so they come and move here. So most of them were definitely East Indian villages. They eventually became Goan villages because you had a large number of Goans migrating. But they're all Catholic villages, mostly in Bombay. So you have Kotachiwadi, which is very popular. Again, it's an East Indian village. You did have Pathari Prabhus in Kotachiwadi. And the Pathari Prabhus are again the original inhabitants of Bombay, from the locals. Then you have Mazgaon, and I think the story of the Mazgaon village and Cavell is very similar. The settlements, again, they decide to come and settle in Mazgaon and then populate that part of Bombay. But in Vasai, for that matter, which is not very far away from Mumbai, you have large East Indian settlement in Vasai. And we don't speak so much about Vasai, Thane, but this is where you actually see a very, very thriving and very, very old, aging. It's actually a community that has aged, and even their cultures have really aged well, because even today they practice some of the things that used to may have been practiced or followed, say, centuries ago, and they do it very diligently. So yes, these are very, very interesting villages, and they're all the villages that were originally the villagers, or their ancestors were originally converted by the Portuguese.
Right.
So Bombay, for that matter, very, very few Protestant Christians. These Protestants mostly they belonged to the British. So they trace their ancestry to the British.
Right.
And even the churches, for that matter, you have St. Thomas Cathedral, you have Afghan Church. They were Protestant churches. But you have a significantly large number of Catholic churches in Bombay.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when I think of Bombay, I first think of
it's very Catholic.
Very Catholic. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I first think of the Catholic culture of Bombay, and then sort of from there on.
Yeah.
But wow, Jane, thank you so much. What a wonderful insight for all of us. And I think, it's opened my eyes to wanting to know more about the community that maybe lost its voice, and the stories that we haven't recorded. And I think, that lovely clip of music as well, like, it's just been such a great insight. Thank you so much for this.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ragini. A pleasure.
Absolutely. And there's been lots of conversation on the chat about, everybody has been talking about the little tidbits they know about the community.
Lovely.
Lots of questions have come through as well, which I've kind of we've talked about. So yes, I think everyone's really enjoyed the chat as well. So thank you once again.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And for everyone watching, please do please do check out Jane's book, Bombay Bal Chow. It is really a lovely read. And if you feel like on a Sunday, it's a perfect Sunday afternoon read. That's how I read it. And so if you feel like sitting down with a cup of tea on a Sunday afternoon in the sun and having a read, then this is the book that you want to have with you. And yeah, that's us for tonight. I just had one thing that I wanted to ask everyone. So we have been, we've been now together for 13 days. Every day we're looking at a new perspective. And I've been thinking of what it is that I can do with some of this material afterwards. And I've realized that, listening to interviews is very, very interesting. And people essentially let us, rent their brains for an hour and give us beautiful insights that would otherwise have taken us a long time to find. But there's lots of resources that go into bringing these interviews together, from the information, from the academic sources, from the books, to the recipes, and of course, the stories that we're hearing. So if you think that a resource pack coming out of these 16 days is something that would be useful for you to learn more about some of the themes that we've talked about, or look deeper into something that particularly caught your interest, just let me know in the comments. I'm gauging interest for what people would like coming out of this. There's a lot of material, and I don't think the conversation stops here. These 16 days is just another beginning of these conversations that have happened over the last 7 years. So thank you so much. Tomorrow we will go deep into the heartland of Punjab and talk very much about a family's experience of partition, and Varnika Aval will be with us to share her experience with us and also talk about the foods of Punjab and how they changed during partition. So do come back tomorrow. Jane, thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Ragini. Thank you.
Good night, folks.
Bye. Good night.